agenda by formulating G20 policy recommendations for advancing financial inclusion and productivity gains through digital public infrastructure. This set of recommendations cover 5 aspects: use of DPIs and accelerating financial inclusion, fostering well-designed DPIs, regulatory and supervisory aspects of DPI, institutional and governance arrangements by DPI, and ensuring customer protection. So DPI has also been integrated into the G20 Financial Inclusion Action Plan, the FIAP, which will run between 2024 and 2026. That's a strong legacy of the Indian Presidency. We also assume the co-chair of the Global Partnership for Financial Inclusion. The implementation of the Financial Inclusion Action Plan, as well as the policy recommendations on DPI, will remain as areas that will continue to be heard across the G20 forum. So, the fourth one, which I'd like to highlight, is the debt resolution under the common framework and also beyond the common framework. Since its establishment in 2021, only Chad as a country has had its debt restructured. The others have been waiting. So since India took over the G20 presidency, good progress has been made in the ongoing country cases under the common framework of debt treatment, and the 3 countries in that are Zambia, Ghana, and Ethiopia. We've also succeeded in using the G20 platform to also put in place a coordinated mechanism to address the debt situation of Sri Lanka, which is outside of the common framework. So G20 will continue discussing the policy-related issues linked to the implementation of the common framework and make periodically such appropriate recommendations. The launch of the Global Sovereign Debt Roundtable, which is co-chaired by IMF, the World Bank, and also the G20 presidency, to enhance the conversation among the various stakeholders and address current shortcomings in the debt restructuring process. That has now become an institution which is actually acting as a catalytic agent in getting resolutions done faster. The 5th point under the finance track, which I'd like to bring to your notice, is the financing of cities of tomorrow. Key concerns of the low-income countries and emerging markets is always been to mobilize resources for financing sustainable, resilient, and also inclusive cities of tomorrow. The G20 principles, which are issued for financing cities of tomorrow to promote effective and efficient use of financial resources, to support urban development that is socially inclusive, environmentally responsible, and economically sustainable, are now all under the framework of the principles which have been used. The MDBs and the development financial institutions can use these principles in their financing plans for urban infrastructure. The 6th, which I'd like to quickly draw your attention, is the 2-pillar solution on global taxation, the international taxation. We've made substantial progress in the 2-pillar solution, and the work has also happened on the exchange of information on immovable property transactions between countries. There is a launch of the pilot program of the South Asia Academy in India for tax and financial crime investigation in collaboration with the OECD. The 7th, on which I'll elaborate, is mechanism to support the timely and adequate mobilization of resources for climate finance. Till date, the conversation was focused on calling on developed countries to say, where is that $100 billion US dollars, which didn't come. But Indian presidency adopted an action-oriented approach, and the G20 explored mechanisms that can support timely and adequate mobilization of resources for climate finance, facilitating access to multilateral climate funds and enhancing their leverage and ability to mobilize private capital has also been our focus. Special focus again on development, demonstration, deployment of green and low carbon technologies. Now the list of outcomes, I've pointed out 7, just 3 more which I'll not go into the detail, but you can take it as enough has been done on that. I'll also put it out for your consideration. Scaling up sustainable finance for social sectors, health and education. Technical assistance for capacity building. Then global conversation on transition policies, especially to include range of options, both on pricing and non-pricing. And the third one, enhancing finance health collaboration so as to cover many other work streams as well. So I listed out 7, elaborated on them, 3 others which have not elaborated, but on all of them, substantial progress and outcomes have been achieved. India's received tremendous support from the G20 members across the table. The outcomes of the Indian presidency are a testimony to India's commitment to multilateralism and for international cooperation. We assure the upcoming Brazilian presidency of our strong support and to continue the momentum on key issues of global importance. I now hand over back to Minister Jaishankar.
Thank you, Nirmala ji. May I now request G20 Sherpa Amitabh Kant to bring out the major outcomes from the Sherpa track.
Thank you, Minister. So first of all, when we started India's presidency, the Prime Minister had said that India's presidency must be inclusive, it must be decisive, it must be ambitious, and it must be action-oriented. The New Delhi Leaders' Declaration has 83 paras in all. All 83 paras have 100% consensus across all countries. There are 8 paras on the geopolitical issue which is entitled Planet, People, Peace and Prosperity. All those 8 paras have 100% acceptance. All countries have unanimously supported the New Delhi Leaders' Declaration. This is one declaration without a single footnote and without any chair's summary. This is a complete statement with 100% unanimity. This demonstrates both the Prime Minister's and India's great ability to bring all developing countries, all emerging markets, all developed countries, China, Russia, everybody together on the same table and bring consensus. Secondly, this has been the most ambitious presidency in G20's history ever, because the number of outcomes it has, both the outcomes and the annex documents are about 112, which is more than 2.5 times which has ever been achieved before. Thirdly, this presidency, if you go through the New Delhi Leaders' Declaration, it has a huge India narrative, it has a huge India footprint, whether you look at the Deccan high-level principles on food security, whether you look at the Chennai high-level principles for blue ocean economy, whether you look at the Goa roadmap for tourism, whether you look at the Gandhinagar implementation roadmap for land restoration, or Jaipur call for enhanced MSMEs, all this will leave a huge footprint of India in G20. So one of the key achievements to my mind, one is that we've achieved a very major green development pact in today's world of climate action and climate finance. Every single country has come together to focus on green development pact, which has financing, which has focused on global greenhouse gas emission by 43% by 2030, which has a doubling provision of adaptive finance by 2025, which has a global biofuel alliance, which has completely new principles of life for sustainable development, which has ending plastic pollution, which has reducing disaster risk, and a whole lot of other components put together as the Green Development Pact of the leaders of G20 countries for a greener world of tomorrow. Secondly, there is a huge focus on accelerating progress on sustainable development goals because the COVID had hit a vast segment of our population. There's a G20 action plan to accelerate progress on SDGs. There is a huge focus on education, health, nutrition. There's a huge focus on creative industries like culture as a transformation for SDGs. And there is a huge focus on inclusive and resilient growth in this entire things, some of which, most of which the finance minister has spoken about, so I'm not talking. But I think one of the biggest achievements of this New Delhi Leaders Declaration is what we've achieved on women-led development with a massive focus on women empowerment and gender equality. And this focuses on reducing labor force participation gap, bridging the gender digital divide. There's a huge focus on gender inclusive climate action. There's a completely big focus on women's food security, nutrition and well-being. And we've created a new working group on empowerment of women, which Brazil will carry forward. There's the next key big focus has been on technological transformation and the digital public infrastructure. Before we started our presidency, there was a vacuum on the digital world. There was no definition of digital public infrastructure. There was no framework. Both the definition and the framework has been accepted by G20, and for the first time, there is a new financial architecture for digital public infrastructure. There is also a global digital public infrastructure repository. There's a huge new focus. For the first time in the world, the G20 leaders have focused on artificial intelligence. They have focused on cyber security. Also, I would say that one of the key aspects of this presidency has been its focus on developing and emerging markets. No document of G20 has had such an immense focus on developing and emerging markets and the voice of the global south as this particular document has. This is a document of the global south. This is a document of the developing countries which came together and spelled out their priorities. And India has been the spokesperson of all the global south and spelled out their priorities in this document. This document also condemns terrorism. It denies terrorist groups safe haven and freedom of operation and many other things. But let me assure you that for the planet, there are several new initiatives on climate and health, and this has been an inclusive G20. This has been a very a G20 where the leaders give a direction to global agendas, and this has laid the foundation for very bold action. But more than anything else, it has amplified the voice of global south. It has also demonstrated that India has a huge capacity of bringing the world together and leading the world in developmental and geopolitical issues as well. So thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, Amitabh. Following up on my colleagues, let me add a few more remarks. While noting that the G20 is not the platform to resolve geopolitical and security issues, the leaders recognized that they can have significant consequences for the global economy. In particular, they dwelt on the ongoing war in Ukraine and the impact it has had, especially on developing and least developing nations still recovering from the pandemic and economic disruption. The 3 F's, food, fuel and fertilizers, were issues of special concern. Another subject that was addressed by them as the Sherpa noted, was countering terrorism and money laundering. The leaders condemned terrorism in all its forms and manifestations and recognized that it constitutes one of the more serious threats to international peace and security. So, in conclusion, as you can all see, all G20 member states have come to New Delhi with a strong sense of responsibility about addressing the most pressing global challenges. Speaking for India, we are clear that no one left behind, as the Finance Minister highlighted, no one left behind is as much a foreign policy goal as it is a domestic one. Indeed, it should be a global one. Obviously, there are differing viewpoints and interests at play in regard to the various issues under discussion. However, we have been able to find common ground on all of them. As a result, we can justifiably state that under Prime Minister Narendra Modi's guidance, the New Delhi Summit has given clear directions for the growth and development of the global economy in the years ahead. We would be glad to respond to your queries. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. Before I hand over, open the floor for questions, let me just mention that the document in question, the New Delhi Declaration, has been uploaded on the website about an hour ago, and please have a look at it. Let me open now the floor. I see gentleman at the back. Yeah, right there at the back on the left. Yeah. Parikshit, right? Yeah, please. No, not there. Behind you.
One question to...
Please introduce yourself and the organization.
I'm Parikshit Luthra from CNBC TV18. My question to Minister Jaishankar and G20 Sherpa Amitabh Kant and also Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman. How difficult was it to have consensus on the wording of the Ukraine-Russia war? This has been a difficult point in every conversation in the G20. There were several drafts circulated. We heard of a new draft this morning as well. Were there any countries which actually helped India in bringing consensus on the table?
I see a name. I see the lady here. Please, ma'am. Yeah, you.
Ma'am, good afternoon. My name is Ruchi Bhatia from Bloomberg News. The Ukraine paragraphs also mention about the work that Turkey did with respect to getting some sort of a consensus on the issue of the Black Sea grain deal as well. Where are things with respect to that, and can we expect any movement on that critical issue anytime soon, because it does concern several nations across the globe? Thank you.
There's a hand there, the gentleman, yeah, right at the back on the left. Microphone, please. Yeah, it's working.
This is Manas Pratim Huyan from Press Trust of India, PTI. In one of the paragraphs referring to the Ukraine conflict, it is mentioned that there were different views and assessment of the situation. So, how do you explain this line about having differences on the Ukraine crisis? The question to Foreign Minister or the G20 Sherpa.
Gentleman here.
Hi, this is Ashish Singh from the Geostrata. Going forward, how will we see action for climate-related adaptation financing for the Global South, especially with India being part of the Troika? Thanks.
We'll take one last question there. Yeah, there. Yeah, the lady there. I'm sorry. Behind you, right at the back.
Okay. Hi, I'm Hamna from Brute. I wanted to know, does India see itself as the leader of the Global South, and how did it assume this role? Because there's been a lot of conversation about bringing the Global South together. So, yeah.
Sir, may I?
I didn't get the last one. How does India see itself as leader of the Global South? Where is this lady? I'll just go with the stop, then I'll hear. Let me respond to some of the questions, and then I'd like request the Sherpa to come in on that after me. how difficult was it to forge consensus on the Ukraine issue? This, as we have pointed out, is a declaration of 83 paragraphs. It has a lot of content. There are a lot of subjects which have been covered, some of which we have spoken about. But obviously, because of the ongoing conflict, the strong views about it, considerable time was spent, especially in the last few days, in regard to geopolitical issues, which really centered around the war in Ukraine. The question who helped, eventually everybody helped because everybody came together for the consensus. But I think if Sherpa would bear me out, I think the emerging markets took a particular lead on this, and many of us have a strong history of working together. Bear in mind that actually you have 4 developing countries in succession as G20 presidency: Indonesia, us, Brazil and South Africa. So, but I would say, rather than who helped, the point to be recognized is that a common landing point was ultimately fashioned out. On the Black Sea grain corridor, there are many discussions going on. As you know, the Foreign Minister of Russia is here. The President of Turkey and his delegation are here. UN Secretary General is here. Other people are here. So it's natural that there would be discussions going on this. In the past, I should add, when the Green Corridor was created at Bali last year, we had also, in our own way, contributed to some bridging of viewpoints and concerns, both between, at that time, between Turkey and Russia, and also worked with the UN Secretary General. On the sentence, that phrase about having different viewpoints and assessments, I think we are being transparent. It is a fact. This is today a very polarizing issue. There are multiple views on this. There are a spectrum of views on this. So I think, in all fairness, it was only right to record what was the reality in the meeting rooms, and I think that is the sense that is sought to be captured. And I will leave the climate action issue to Sherpa, and I don't know if Finance Minister would like to speak on it. But on the global south, look, it is not, what India has tried to do, beginning with our presidency, was to seek to ensure that the concerns of the global south constitute the core agenda of the G20 deliberations. Because after 3 years of pandemic, after economic disruptions of various kinds, after the impact of the Ukraine conflict, after climate events, the fact is that the countries of the global south are in deep economic distress. And that distress has not, in our view, been fully recognized till now. And we therefore very consciously started off with the Voice of the Global South Summit. But again, I emphasize, the voice was of the summit. It was the voice of 125 countries who participated in that summit. But we, as the G20 presidency, we saw it as our responsibility of distilling the views which were expressed in that summit and putting it before the rest of the G20. And we can take a lot of satisfaction that many of the issues that the Finance Minister highlighted, which the Sherpa highlighted, these are truly global south issues, and we hope that certainly the Delhi summit and the deliberations which will take place today and tomorrow would give strong guidance to take them forward. Sherpa, Amitabh ji, if you want to add to it.
On the Russia-Ukraine crisis, India worked very closely with Brazil, South Africa and Indonesia. And I want to say that it was the emerging markets which played a very key role. India worked with all the emerging markets which played a very key role. There was very tough, very ruthless negotiations which went on for several days non-stop. And I really feel that in the end, the issue was clinched because of the leadership of the Prime Minister, because eventually we had to say that the leader wants it and this has to be delivered. And secondly, I really want to thank Mr. Jaishankar. I constantly took his advice and he guided me, and he gave me two really outstanding officers. One was Naidu, Nag Naidu, who's a very outstanding officer and very enthusiastic, motivated young officer who worked with me, Inam Gambhir. They did a really outstanding job as far as the geopolitical issues concerned. I had two other Foreign Service officers who've done brilliant work, Abhay Thakur and Ashish Sinha, on different aspects. But on geopolitics, they've done a really spectacular work. So it was really great teamwork. It was just brilliant teamwork by India, which has enabled us to achieve consensus on an issue on which the world has evaded any consensus. Even the Bali document which we talk about, actually we could not move forward with it because we could not arrive consensus in it for the first meeting. And on climate, let me tell you that this is one of the most ambitious document on climate, because it talks about almost 5.9. It moves first the language from billions to trillions, and secondly it talks about 5.9 trillion requirement for the presidency and for the G20 countries. And it lays a huge focus on life principles. It lays a huge focus on reforms of the multilateral institutions, because they were designed for the World War II and not for climate action. So all of these, it talks about new financing instruments, many other things, but in totality, if you look at it, it's probably the most vibrant, the most dynamic, and the most ambitious document on climate action that has come out anywhere.
Finance Minister.
Just to add one line on the climate finance matter, the question was raised whether mitigation is being dealt with or not. It deals with the mitigation, all right, but it also looks at adaptation and resilience. I think now the debate on climate finance is also moving much more into resilience, whether it is infrastructure or planning for it or funding. Resilience takes precedence. That is one. And second, country-specific solutions are now going to be possible. It's not going to be one size fits all. The problem of each country, particularly on climate, is so different from one another. So this Delhi Declaration and also the discussions which were held during India Presidency has focused on that. And thirdly, pricing and non-pricing tools are also now available for countries to adopt. It is not just going to be price it if it is carbon intensive and forget the others. Countries do demand pricing as one of the tools, but non-pricing solutions are also going to be a lot more friendlier to countries with different carbon emission levels. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll open there's a lady here. Yeah, please. It's okay. No. Ma'am, the microphone's already there. Yeah, go ahead, ma'am. You have the microphone.
Hello. Yeah. Good evening to the panel. This is Priyashmita. I'm from Informist Media. My question is directed to ma'am. That is, now that there is a global acceptance of the fact, or at least a G20 acceptance of the fact regarding food and energy security, what is the immediate ramification on inflation and growth forecast, both domestically and globally, that you see? Thank you.
Well, globally, I think it will have...
Ma'am, we can take questions together. Okay. Yeah, gentlemen there. Yeah, you. The gentleman there who's put his hand up, if you could give the microphone to him. Yeah, thank you. No, not him, not him. I'll come to you, sir. I'll come to you in a minute. Person in front of you. Hold on there at the back. Yes, sir, you go ahead. You had the floor.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, not you, sir. Okay, since you have the microphone, go ahead. Go ahead. I don't want to waste time. Go ahead.
Hi, Stephen Borwick of Nikkei Asia. My question is for Foreign Minister Jaishankar. Is today's achievement a step towards achieving what India has described as a world of greater multi-alignment, as opposed to the more old-fashioned sense of an international rules-based order? Thank you.
Yes, sir. You had the microphone. Go ahead. Is the microphone on?
Yeah, thank you very much. I just wanted Minister
Please
Jaishankar,
introduce yourself.
Dr. Wail Awad from Sana, correspondent in India. Mr. Jaishankar, Honorable Minister, when you talked of the counter-terrorism measure, how serious was the members of the G20 and fighting terrorism together? Thank you.
Yes, ma'am. You had a hand up quite someone. Yes, you right here, second row.
Samira Hussain with BBC News. I want to go back to Russia, and if you look at the language that was used in Bali, and you look at the language that was used now, gone is any reference to Russia and its aggression. Were those concessions made in order to get Russia to sign on, and do you think the weight of this has been watered down, and does that take away from its importance, especially when you're talking about fuel and food security?
Yes, you. Yeah. Right in front. No, ahead of him, please. I saw his hand. Yes, you. Please, go ahead.
Hello. Yeah, sir, Rishikesh from the Press Trust of India. Everyone must surprised by this outcome.
My question is that the personal bonding of PM Modi with President Biden and Russian President Putin, what was their contribution to bring this declaration? And did you have one question or two questions?
One more. There was a gentleman there. Yeah, sitting there. Yeah, behind you. Yeah, Pranay, go ahead.
Sir, Pranay Upadhyay who's Z News se.
I'm from Z News. My question is this, that the inclusion of African Union in G20, it has been done in a record time, because in June the Prime Minister...
इसमें शामिल है. क्या कुछ इसके पीछे हुआ, इंडिया ने इसमें कितना इन्वेस्ट किया इसकी लॉबिंग के लिए या इस प्रयास के लिए, थोड़ा अगर आप इस बारे में साझा कर सकें.
India has made in this direction.
Maybe Finance Minister would like to...
On the inflation question, globally, of course, it's going to have an impact the moment it is executed. The understanding is executed and the grain movements start from Russia and from Ukraine. So, particularly countries which have been hard-pressed, which have originally and for a very long time depended on grains coming from these two countries, are now waiting to have that back again. As a result, I think it will cool off inflation, particularly in food grains. Domestically, we've had very little grains coming in. Except for edible oil, particularly sunflower oil, our imports have not been so much dependent on these countries. There are times when we've brought in extra edible oil, and therefore to that extent, yes, it will certainly have an impact on domestic inflation as well. But largely, India's domestic inflation is affected by vagaries of the monsoon or supply side problems. Global impact is not as much as countries which are outside dependent on grains coming completely for their consumption from outside.
If I could respond to the question whether this is a world of monthly alignment. I mean, first of all, when we are talking about G20, let us remember that this is a forum for international economic cooperation. Its primary focus is on economic growth and development. And in a way, the G20 itself is a reflection of multipolarity. The fact that there was, in a way, the salience of G7 was a decade ago replaced by the salience of the G20. I think that itself was a statement. Now, what you see before you in terms of the leaders' declaration and the discussions that are going on are obviously discussions among a very broad, very diverse range of countries at different levels of economic development, whose economic and social, cultural composition is quite different from each other. So I think in that sense it's quite reasonable to assume that there is a certain there's a spectrum of views and interests out here which we have tried to harmonize to produce the declaration. The question on counter-terrorism, what happens, I would draw your attention to paragraphs 74 and 75 of the Leaders' Declaration. 75 speaks about the role of the FATF because clearly the financing of terrorism is a very strong concern which the entire international community, not just the G20, shares. The 74 deals with illicit trafficking and diversion of small arms and light weapons. So I think these are concerns. So within the G20, I think these conversations are quite helpful, but obviously in terms of policy action, they will be carried into their particular mechanisms and forums which focus on the issue. With regard to the to the comparison with the Bali Declaration, I would only say Bali was Bali and New Delhi is New Delhi. I mean, Bali was a year ago. The context, the situation was different. Many things have happened since then, and in fact, if you see in the geopolitical segment of the Leaders' Declaration, there are in totality 8 paragraphs, 7 of which actually focus on the Ukraine issue, and many of them highlight problems which are of great contemporary significance. I mean, including the efforts of the Istanbul agreements, the concerns about unimpeded deliveries of grain, foodstuff and fertilizers, the issues of attacks on the relevant infrastructure. So I think it's, one should not have a theological view of this. I think the New Delhi Declaration responds to the situation and concerns as it is today, just as the Bali Declaration did in a situation which was there a year ago. And finally, with regard to the
your question was about PM's personal bonding.
Today, in fact, not just today, yesterday, and in some cases at the Jakarta East Asia Summit as well, where the Prime Minister was there. Prime Minister did speak to a number of his counterparts with regard to what was under discussion at this summit. It is the responsibility of the Sherpa and of the ministers to put together the multiple strands and harmonize it into a document. But at the end of the day, I mean, I obviously do not want to go into very specific details, but at the end of the day, there are always gaps and issues and viewpoints. And I think today, especially Prime Minister's talking to a number of leaders during the day, his meetings yesterday with some of them, with others during the Jakarta meeting of the ES, I think were all very, very influential, or I would say almost determining in producing an outcome. और जो आखिरी सवाल जो आपका था,
The last question that
कि
you
EU का
asked
inclusion जो है,
about
उसकी गति
African
माने बहुत
Union's
तेज
union,
गति से हुई।
the momentum
मैं
was
आप लोगों
very
को,
quick.
एक याद दिलाना चाहता हूं कि जो बाली समिट के दौरान, बाली के समिट के अंत में जो उस समय अफ्रीकन यूनियन के अध्यक्ष जो थे, सेनेगल के राष्ट्रपति थे मैकी सॉल, तो वो उस समय प्रधानमंत्री और इंडोनेशिया के राष्ट्रपति के पास आए और उनकी शिकायत थी कि G20 की सदस्यता के बारे में जो अफ्रीकन यूनियन का जो हक जो बनता है उस पर बिल्कुल चर्चा नहीं हुई थी। तो उस समय प्रधानमंत्री जी ने उनको आश्वासन दिया था कि भारत के
that point in time that under G20 presidency it will certainly be done, and this is the guarantee of Modi, and you have seen that he has delivered this assurance that he had made, and during BRICS summit the Magnus, the then president, came to the Prime Minister and said that you had he reminded him that you had assured us and you really impacted it.
Bali, the president of Senegal, Macky Sall, all right, that was interpreted. Thank you very much for saving me in the trouble. Would you like to add something on any of them? Is there?
So we'll take a few more questions, or
I can one last.
Okay, I have a gentleman here. Yeah, go ahead. Microphone here with the gentleman in the front row.
This is Nikhil from the BBC. The question is for the Finance Minister. You said that the G20 now has its own mechanism on climate finance. So does that mean that the $100 billion promise from the West or the developed countries is pretty much dead now?
One more question. I had a hand somewhere here on the right. Yeah, that's the gentleman. Yeah, you please go ahead. Piche, right there.
At the back, please, at the back.
The gentleman there.
Hi.
No, it was the gentleman here. Yeah, you.
Yeah.
No, not there. You're behind you. Okay, if you've got the mic, just ask. We can't waste.
This is Mithil from NBC News. I wanted to ask two questions.
One question, please.
Okay, one question. The absence of President Xi Jinping at this summit, does India see this as a snub towards Prime Minister Narendra Modi, especially with the border issues, as well as President Joe Biden?
You have the microphone. You're next.
Sir, I'm Sahil from ANI News Agency. Sir, what kind of framework can be expected regarding crypto assets among the G20 nations?
What is it?
I saw one hand. Yes, gentleman. Yes, sir. Here. You have the microphone. Go ahead.
What kind? Could you just have that question?
Could you ask the question again on the crypto? I think your question was.
Yeah.
Yeah. Could you repeat that, Minister? Ma'am, they could not pick it up.
What kind of framework can be expected regarding the crypto assets among the G20 nations?
Crypto assets from.
And in addition to that, ma'am, supplementary question that since we have a consensus on making common framework on crypto assets, and G20 presidency will work with FSBC and IMF
what is your
closely.
question, please?
But the joint report of FSBC and IMF says that banning a blanket ban on crypto assets is not a solution. So my question is that is there a consensus on just to regulate it or ban it completely?
Okay. You, last question.
This is Matish Yudin from Climate Home News. You said this is the most ambitious document ever on climate, but India was pursuing an expanded language on phasing down fossil fuels, while the final declaration basically goes back to just phasing down coal. Are you disappointed with this outcome?
So I think we're running out of time, and I'll close here with that. I do think we're out of time. So I think we're running out of time, and I will hand over the floor to ma'am.
I'll start with the crypto. Well, it's really heartening that you've gone through the report. But the point is, the FSB's report and the IMF's report, FSB's concentrated more on the regulation, and IMF's looked at the macroeconomic implications. So the synthesis paper is something which the G20 membership will go through in detail. There is one more meeting under our presidency for the finance track in Marrakesh. I remember with great sense of responsibility and sorrow. The earthquake which has happened very close to Marrakesh. I hope the people of Morocco are in a position to take on, and I was glad to hear the Prime Minister during this session in the morning that India stands with Morocco and we will be ready to do any assistance that the government of Morocco would desire us to do. So with that said, with a heavy heart, the next meeting was scheduled for Marrakesh, and there the FSB report and the IMF, which is the synthesis report, will be discussed, and the materials are all already available in public domain. So it is for the membership to take a call as to how it wants to move on it. A framework or a template, whatever be it. I don't think we've given it a name as yet. And also to now discuss whether it is going to be a regulation only and not a ban. I'm not getting into that debate. It is the reports, the synthesis, and also the early IMF report, both of which have been discussed. You're right in saying this report says this. It's up to the G20 membership to take a call on how it wants to move forward. And that you'll get to know more during the autumn meet of the World Bank. There was a question on climate finance. I don't think it is a question of are you writing off this 100 billion which was promised earlier, and now that you've come up with a newer way of the funding climate. I don't think it is this or that. Whatever trickle had come earlier of the 100 billion, or what it can come now through the private partnership or bringing in philanthropy or anything else, can keep going on that. But the fact remains that now the larger discussion has brought in very many more elements of how to finance. So both will have its own role to play, because climate issues attain great sense of urgency.
Would you like to speak on?
So on the fossil fuel, I'll like to say that if you read through the entire document, it's very, very ambitious. First of all, for the first time, G20 has talked about tripling of renewable energy capacity by 2030 globally. Secondly, this is the first document which talks about, which has very huge focus on fossil subsidies. And thirdly, this is the first time that there is a huge focus on billions to trillions of dollars in climate finance. There is a huge focus on Global Biofuel Alliance, which will be launched today. There's a huge focus on green hydrogen, and also there's a massive focus on energy, resource efficiency and circular economy industry coalition, and there's a focus on, to my mind, very huge focus on, the document is actually a very, very strong focus on lifestyle for environment, which is life, which the Prime Minister has initiated, and several studies have said that it can lead to 20%, an IEA study has said that it can lead to 20% reduction in greenhouse emissions. So huge focus on climate action.
So let me conclude with the last question, which is the levels of participation. I think it's for every country to decide at what level they would be represented. I don't think one should read overly.
Allowed to go anywhere inside the NDMC area, and this is the kind of security that we have been reporting out here at CNN News 18, that there is absolute watertight security that can be seen on the ground, making sure that in this big ticket event there is no lapses, there is no loophole that is left, and that is the reason why not only the Delhi police but also members of the ITBP and central police forces have also been deployed to make sure that there is absolutely no issue, or there is.
Between 9 a.m. and 9:45 a.m., movement from various hotels taking the heads of states and delegates to the Bharat Mandapam is beginning, and ahead of that, security bandobast is being tightened further. You can see these are roads from near Hotel Oberoi, near Hotel Lodhi, and also the Claridges which hosts the French heads of state and the French delegation. So in that generic area, multiple layers of barricades have been put up. Delhi police is manning these barricades. Even people with valid I-cards are not being allowed to move further. Till yesterday, even though this flyover takes you, this is still South Delhi, this is not New Delhi area, but until yesterday, people were being allowed to move, but today there are multiple layers of barricading here. Delhi police is here, paramilitary forces deployed as well. More barricades have been brought in, and they are ensuring that people don't really cross over this area. This will ultimately lead you to Bharat Mandapam. What is the drill that is being followed as far as movement of heads of states are concerned? Advanced security liaison has been conducted. There are security and liaison officers sitting with the heads of the security delegations of the various countries and really figuring out movements, etc. There are specific flags, specific routes that are marked. There are contingency plans as well. When a head of state moves from the hotel to the Bharat Mandapam towards the Pragati Maidan area, if there is an exigency, there are routes that have been marked as to where the driver, specially trained driver, can take the car carrying the heads of state. And here you see, as police is stopping more and more vehicles, even checking the I-card, even government I-cards are being checked.
There you can see Prime Minister Narendra Modi at the Bharat Mandapam. This is an important piece of information that he has just, in fact, put out. And after that, we had seen the press conference that was addressed by the External Affairs Minister, the Finance Minister, and also the G20 Sherpa of having reached a consensus on the Delhi Declaration. There you can see the visuals of the Bangladesh Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina along with the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi. This is a photo opportunity after that all-important bilateral that the two leaders in fact engaged in yesterday. This was after Sheikh Hasina had landed in the national capital. Remember, India's relationship with Bangladesh is an important one. It is a next door neighbor, and it becomes crucial what really comes out as far as that big bilateral. There was an important statement that Sheikh Hasina had made coming right ahead of her Delhi visit, where she had spoken about the minorities in her country, the Hindu minorities who do not have to fear any kind of issues, and that was something that was much talked about. I believe that was also part of the conversation. But right now, this photo opportunity, an all-important one, with Prime Minister Narendra Modi and the Bangladesh Prime Minister, Ms. Sheikh Hasina. My colleague Pallavi is also with us on the broadcast. Pallavi, the all-important press conference just over, talking about a consensus on the joint communique. In fact, the leaders who addressed the press conference, including the External Affairs Minister, the Finance Minister, also the G20 Sherpa, they were very, very jubilant about the fact that how there was 100% unanimity about the Delhi Declaration. And now we see Sheikh Hasina along with Prime Minister Narendra Modi. Just first speak to our viewers about the significance of these visuals, especially after the bilateral that the two leaders engaged in, and then we'll go further and talk about the press conference that's just about concluded.
Well, I mean, there's a reason, and I think justifiably so, why everyone who was at the press conference was jubilant, and of course it was beaming. You know, these are those negotiations which have been held for almost a year, and coming out with a New Delhi resolution or a declaration certainly has not been easy. But just to go through some of the pictures which we just saw, where we saw those members or the delegates come one by one, and the Prime Minister meeting all of them. In a sense, that's a finale which takes place for today, just after a New Delhi declaration has been finalized. And from here on, they go back to their respective hotels. Some meetings are, of course, lined up, and then they're going to reassemble here at the Bharat Mandapam for the presidential banquet, which again has been mired in a lot of political controversy.
Yes.
But to talk about the New Delhi declaration, well, I think the focus is very, very clear. The focus certainly has touchings upon all the points which India certainly wanted to touch upon in terms of trade and economics of it. We've been talking about it, cryptocurrency, taxation, double taxation, economic offences, which requires a coordinated, synchronized approach that finds its way very much into the declaration. The war, the Russia-Ukraine war, while Russia is not specifically mentioned, it does talk about Ukraine not once but 4 times over in the declaration. But it also talks about the fact that how all of them need to come together to fight against any war. The Prime Minister's comments that, this is not an era of war, it should not be an era of war, that is a very overpowering presence in this declaration. And of course, it talks in details about a fight against terrorism. All of them need to come together on that. And finally, of course, the Prime Minister's dream project, how to deal with climate change. That also finds a lot of mention, but a lot of emphasis has certainly been put on the financial track.
Also, Pallavi, since we're talking about the joint consensus, the declaration, the Delhi declaration, there was an underlying statement that was made not just by the G20 Sherpa, Mr. Amitabh Kant, but also by the External Affairs Minister, Dr. S. Jaishankar, on how the emerging economies of Brazil, of South Africa, Indonesia, how they, in fact, were the key players at arriving at this, or getting the world leaders to arrive at this consensus. Just throw light on that statement also.
See, so Finance Ministry sources in their multiple briefings have been telling us the ones who really created trouble for them, if we can use that word, who were very difficult to deal with, somewhat difficult to deal with, were actually developed countries, and of course countries like China, Russia and Saudi Arabia. They perhaps did not even understand what is it that the other countries require. But countries in Africa, which is why India insisted on the Union of African States should be a part of the G20 Summit as well. Apart from that, countries like Brazil and many others who actually have been a victim of the developed countries not understanding their point of view, they are the ones who are most cooperative, and they in a sense applied pressure. It is in
emissions, increase access to clean cooking fuel, increase farmers' income, and expand biofuels adoption. The Global Biofuels Alliance.
Excellency, we will now take a group photograph. Thank you, Excellencies, for launching the Global Biofuel Alliance. I would request all the media representatives to remain in the room while the media.
We're just now waiting for the second session of the day, the Global Biofuels Alliance. You can see the world leaders held together with a joint partnership vis-a-vis that. My colleague Pallavi was also mentioning how climate change and dealing with climate change becomes a very, very pressing issue before the G20, the group of 20 world leaders. And today we're looking at the session 2. This is right after the big announcement that has been made on the joint communique, and contributing to energy security, strengthening circular economy, and also talking about how there needs to be refraining from use of force or for territorial acquisition when it comes to the Russia-Ukraine crisis. All of that has been discussed. Now we're waiting for the Global Biofuels Alliance session to begin. Ahead of that, you can see that big photo opportunity with Prime Minister Narendra Modi representing India as a G20 president at the center of that. You can also see the Bangladesh Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina among other world leaders who are assembled for that global global biofuels alliance. My colleagues Anand Narsimhan and Pallavi Ghosh continue to be with us on the broadcast. Anand, I would toss it to you This has been a very, very important announcement by the G20 Sherpa and the External Affairs Minister and also the Finance Minister about a consensus that's been arrived at. There has been almost a declaration of 83 paragraphs, lot of content there. Geopolitical conflict has been dealt with as far as the joint communique is concerned. This is a big day for the country.
Well, there are 8 paragraphs on people and also when that's what Amitabh Kant, where the Sherpa said with respect to geopolitics, there are 8 paras. But this is I'm going to read out the 2 operative paras and see how beautifully it's been worded. And that's why consensus has been arrived at. This is what the para says. Concerning the war in Ukraine, while recalling the discussion in Bali, we reiterated our national positions and resolutions adopted at the UN Security Council and the UN General Assembly, and the references have been made and understood and underscored that all states must act in a manner consistent with the purposes and principles of the UN Charter in its entirety. In line with the UN Charter, all states must refrain from the threat or use of force to seek territorial acquisition against the territorial integrity and sovereignty and political independence of any state. The use or threat of use of nuclear weapons is inadmissible. Reaffirming that the G20 is the premier forum for international economic cooperation and recognizing that while the G20 is not the platform to resolve geopolitical and security issues, we acknowledge that these issues can have significant consequences for the global economy. So this is how it's been worded. So everything that's been said and adopted in the UN, the UNGA and the UN Charter has been incorporated. They have underscored their respective positions. So that's been advised. That is the reason why consensus has come, because no country has been specifically named, but the intent is very clear that this is not the time of war. Also, there very clearly the credit being given by Bharat and the ministers, be it Subramaniam Jaishankar, the foreign minister, or the Sherpa Amitabh Kant, to the emerging nations, saying it's the emerging nations who played a pivotal role in getting the likes of Russia and China on board. And we had already got an indication that America will be on board as far as this the wording and the declaration is concerned, because we had Jake Sullivan say that it is being approached with an intent of compromise. So specifically naming Russia and China, and in this case has been deferred. So that's the come down or the climb down compromise made by the West. On the other hand, Russia and China not opposing the fact that the territorial acquisition, use of force, etc. has been underscored, and that threat of nuclear war is inadmissible. So these aspects have been underscored. So clearly, there has been efforts. There is a reason why there was a conversation that was had between Subramaniam Jaishankar and Foreign Minister Lavrov at the ASEAN East Asia Summit, and thereafter even on the the BRICS. Then more importantly, the Turkey president, who's present here, Erdogan, he had made a trip to Moscow. So they have credited Turkey, they have credited Indonesia, they have credited nations, emerging nations, for playing a pivotal role in bringing consensus. And more importantly, all the 80 paragraphs, there is no addendum, there are no bylines, there are no footnotes, nothing. Everybody is on board on all parameters. 8 paragraphs out of 80 for geopolitics. So the remaining 72 are for the greater reason why the G20 came together in the first place. That's important.
Also, Pallavi, let me bring you in here and taking on from the point that Anand made, the remaining 72 paragraphs that in fact become a key focus area of the G20. And also one of the key questions was how India has positioned itself as the leader of the Global South, or the voice of the Global South. That question was also made to the External Affairs Minister. He very beautifully addressed it in the press conference as well. And this is one communication that is really coming out, because if we go back to the geopolitical conflict question, and taking a cue from the Prime Minister, his introductory address in the morning, he also spoke about human suffering and the negative impact on food and energy security, and that also found mention in that joint communique. How does one amalgamate all of these points and look at the situation?
So what is it that India is trying to do diplomatically? Not only pushing its case, which of course any country does so, but at the same time acting as a champion of those countries or those people who no one talks about, who no one cares about. In fact, when I did speak to a spokesperson of the South African president a short while back, he told me that, we really laud the Prime Minister for the fact that while everyone forgot to include us in the G20, which is the African Union, the Prime Minister thought about it. I think that's what India is trying to do, to project itself as a champion of the downtrodden, the backwards, who no one talks about. In that sense, becoming a superpower itself, because, the selfishness of the developed countries is something many critics have often spoken about. And here the Prime Minister, and if you look at the New Delhi declaration, a large amount of focus really has been given on aid, what kind of things, humanitarian approach we require as far as the development schemes are concerned. Simple things, for example, eradicating plastic, because this is a point which has been consistently made by India on international platform, that who are the ones who suffer the most with the increasing carbon footprints? It's the developing countries, it's the backward countries, and therefore the developed nations actually owe it to the world, and they cannot develop at the cost of the developing countries. That sense of responsibility is very important for the countries, and that's where the concept of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam comes in. That the entire world is one earth, one family, one future, and India wants to take the lead on that. That is very much reflected in the New Delhi declaration, and I'm presuming in a short while from now, the biofuel global alliance is also likely to be announced formally. Over there also, you're going to see the entire footnote, the entire focus of that alliance is that how biofuel is very important to have a cleaner world, but also to address the growing energy needs of the developing countries, the aspirational countries, and how they can reduce their dependence on the developed countries.
Right. Pallavi and Anand, I request you to stay on with us. We will continue to track everything that's coming out of the G20 Summit, day one of the summit. An important declaration that has just come about in the joint consensus. There was a press conference that was addressed by the leaders, the External Affairs Minister, the Finance Minister, the G20 Sherpa, and there was a very jubilant sort of a statement that had come out. Too many questions that were taken by all of these leaders. The most important question, Anand, was about how difficult...
If you can hear me...
Yes, Anand, please go ahead.
If you can hear me, allow me to interrupt you, because Shubhangi Sharma, who's actually contributing on foreign policy and geopolitics at Network 18 at first post on news18.com, has made an important point. Look at the role India is playing. Bangladesh's Hasina government and the Biden White House had fallen out. US had been explicitly targeting the leadership in Bangladesh, accused by the US for interfering in its democratic process. Now, they are saying, reports say that India was unhappy with the conduct because Sheikh Hasina is a friend of India. So PM Modi met President Biden and also Sheikh Hasina yesterday, and look what's happened at the G20 forum today. It's a selfie between the two leaders.
इस स्पेशल इवेंट में आप सबका हार्दिक स्वागत है। मेरे मित्र राष्ट्रपति बाइडेन के साथ इस इवेंट को को-चेयर करते हुए मुझे हार्दिक खुशी हो रही है। आज हम सब ने एक महत्वपूर्ण और ऐतिहासिक समझौता संपन्न होते हुए देखा है। आने वाले समय में यह भारत, पश्चिम एशिया और यूरोप के बीच इकोनॉमिक इंटीग्रेशन का प्रभावी माध्यम होगा। यह पूरे विश्व में कनेक्टिविटी और विकास को सस्टेनेबल दिशा प्रदान करेगा। मैं हिज एक्सेलेंसी राष्ट्रपति बाइडेन, हिज रॉयल हाइनेस क्राउन प्रिंस एंड प्राइम मिनिस्टर मोहम्मद बिन सलमान, हिज रॉयल हाइनेस राष्ट्रपति शेख मोहम्मद बिन जायद, हिज एक्सेलेंसी राष्ट्रपति मैक्रो, हिज एक्सेलेंसी चांसलर सोल्च, हर एक्सेलेंसी प्रधानमंत्री मेलोनी और हर एक्सेलेंसी प्रेसिडेंट वॉन डेर लेयन, इन सबको इस इनिशिएटिव के लिए मैं बहुत बहुत बधाई देता हूं। फ्रेंड्स, मजबूत कनेक्टिविटी और इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर मानव सभ्यता के विकास का मूल आधार है। भारत ने अपनी विकास यात्रा में इस विषय को सर्वोच्च प्राथमिकता दी है। फिजिकल इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर के साथ साथ सोशल, डिजिटल तथा फाइनेंशियल इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर में अभूतपूर्व पैमाने पर निवेश हो रहा है। इससे हम एक विकसित भारत की मजबूत नींव रख रहे हैं। हमने ग्लोबल साउथ के अनेक देशों में एक विश्वसनीय पार्टनर के रूप में एनर्जी, रेलवे, वाटर, टेक्नोलॉजी पार्क्स जैसे क्षेत्रों में इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर प्रोजेक्ट्स इंप्लीमेंट किए हैं। इन प्रयासों में हमने डिमांड ड्रिवन और ट्रांसपेरेंट अप्रोच पर विशेष रूप से बल दिया है। पीजीआईआई के माध्यम से हम ग्लोबल साउथ के देशों में इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर गैप को कम करने में महत्वपूर्ण योगदान दे सकते हैं। फ्रेंड्स, भारत कनेक्टिविटी को क्षेत्रीय सीमाओं में नहीं मापता। सभी क्षेत्रों के साथ कनेक्टिविटी बढ़ाना भारत की मुख्य प्राथमिकता है। हमारा मानना है कि कनेक्टिविटी विभिन्न देशों के बीच आपसी व्यापार ही नहीं, आपसी विश्वास भी बढ़ाने का स्रोत है। कनेक्टिविटी इनिशिएटिव्स को प्रमोट करते हुए कुछ मूलभूत सिद्धांतों का सुनिश्चित किया जाना महत्वपूर्ण है, जैसे अंतर्राष्ट्रीय नॉर्म्स, रूल्स तथा लॉज का पालन, सभी देशों की संप्रभुता और क्षेत्रीय अखंडता का सम्मान, डेट बर्डन की जगह फाइनेंशियल वायबिलिटी को बढ़ावा देना और पर्यावरण के सभी मापदंडों का पालन करना। आज जब हम कनेक्टिविटी का इतना बड़ा इनिशिएटिव ले रहे हैं, तब हम आने वाली पीढ़ियों के सपनों के विस्तार के बीज बो रहे हैं। मैं इस ऐतिहासिक अवसर पर सभी लीडर्स को मैं बहुत बहुत शुभकामनाएं देता हूं और सबका बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद करता हूं।
Thank you, sir. India and the United States of America co-chair this initiative, and now, as the co-chair, I invite the President of the United States for his remarks.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you, all my colleagues. This is, someone once said in a similar domestic action that was positive, this is a big deal. This is a real big deal. And I want to thank you, Mr. Prime Minister. One Earth, one family, one future. That's the focus of this G20 Summit. And in many ways, it's also the focus of this partnership that we're talking about today. Building sustainable, resilient infrastructure, making quality infrastructure investments, and creating a better future. A future that presents greater opportunity, dignity, and prosperity for everyone. Last year, we came together as one to commit to this vision. And this afternoon, I want to highlight the key ways in which the United States and our partners are working to make this a reality. Economic corridors. You're going to hear that phrase more than once, I expect, over the next decade. Economic corridors. As we work to address infrastructure gaps across low- and middle-income countries, we need to maximize the impact of our investments. That's why a few months ago I announced that the United States will work with our partners to invest in economic corridors. In practice, it means we're focusing on regional infrastructure projects that deliver results across multiple countries and in multiple sectors. And today I'm proud to announce that we've finalized a historic agreement for a new India, Middle East, Europe economic corridor. As a key part of this corridor, we're going to invest in ships and rail that extends from India all the way to Europe, connected by the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and Israel. Bridging ports across 2 continents, unlocking endless opportunities, including making it far easier to trade, export clean energy, expand access to reliable, clean electricity, lay cables that will connect communities and secure a stable internet, contributing to a more stable, more prosperous, and integrated Middle East. And I want to thank the sponsors. And I particularly want to thank Prime Minister Modi and the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, and President von der Leyen and the European Commissions. And since he's not speaking today, I wanted to, well, maybe he is speaking today. I had a note he wasn't speaking. At any rate, I'm going to stop there. In the Sub-Saharan Africa, we're working in a private-public partnership as well to invest in a trans-African corridor. That includes a new partner, the European Union. President von der Leyen, thank you for making this very possible. Together, as part of this corridor, we're going to invest in a new rail line that will extend from the western port in Angola to the DRC, to Zambia, and ultimately the Indian Ocean. It's a project that's about far from just laying tracks. It's about creating jobs, increasing trade, strengthening supply chains, boosting connectivity, laying foundations that will strengthen commerce and food security for people across multiple countries. This is a game-changing regional investment, and both of these are huge, huge steps forward. But they're far from the only ones. We're continuing to make big investments in infrastructure around the world. That includes a solar energy site, an insulin manufacturing facility, and electricity project right here in India. We're continuing to develop economic corridors across Africa, Asia, and the Americas. And together with our partners, we're working to mobilize the trillions of investment needed to close infrastructure gaps around the world, including the formation of a new investor forum that the United States will host in a couple weeks. Let me close with this. The world stands at an inflection point in history, a point where decisions we make today are going to affect the course of our future, all of our futures for decades to come. A point where our investments are more critical than ever. So together, let's continue to work as one to seize this moment in history and maximize our collective investments. To find new partners, to unlock new capital. Because when we invest in low and middle income countries, all countries benefit. When we invest in emerging economies, all economies benefit. And when we invest in the future of people anywhere, people everywhere benefit. So I want to thank you again for being here. I look forward to working with all of you, and I'm going to turn it back to the Prime Minister. Thank you.
Thank you, Excellency. We now invite the Crown Prince and the Prime Minister of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia for his remarks.
أصحاب الفخامة والسمو والمعالي الحضور الكرام، السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. يسعدني اليوم نجتمع في هذا البلد الصديق لتوقيع مذكرة تفاهم بشأن مشروع ممر اقتصادي بين الهند والشرق الأوسط وأوروبا، وذلك تتويجا لما عملنا عليه سويا خلال الأشهر الماضية لبلورة الأسس التي بنيت عليه هذه المذكرة، بما يحقق مصالح مشتركة لدولنا من خلال تعزيز الترابط الاقتصادي وما ينعكس إيجابا على شركائنا في الدول الأخرى والاقتصاد العالمي بصورة عامة. سوف يسهم هذا المشروع في تطوير وتأهيل البنى التحتية التي تشمل سكك حديدية وربط الموانئ وزيادة مرور السلع والخدمات وتعزيز التبادل التجاري بين الأطراف المعنية ومد خطوط الأنابيب لتصدير واستيراد الكهرباء والهيدروجين لتعزيز أمن إمدادات الطاقة العالمي، بالإضافة إلى كابلات لنقل البيانات من خلال شبكة عابرة الحدود ذات كفاءة وموثوقية عالية. كما تدعم هذه المذكرة جهود تطوير الطاقة النظيفة، وسيساهم تنفيذها في توليد فرص عمل جديدة ونوعية ومكاسب طويلة الأمد على امتداد الممرات العبور لجميع الأطراف. الحضور الكرام، أن تحقيق ما اتفقنا عليه في هذه المذكرة يتطلب الاستمرار في الجهود التي بذلناها والبدء الفوري في تطوير الآليات اللازمة لتنفيذه وفق الإطار الزمني الذي تم الاتفاق عليه.
In conclusion, I'd like to commend the PGII launched by President Biden with the participation of Saudi Arabia in $20 billion. We look forward to the integration of the initiative and the Economic Corridor project, which is announced in this meeting. I would like to thank those who worked with us to reach this founding step to establish this important economic corridor. My best regard to you all.
Thank you, Your Highness. May I now invite the President of the European Commission for her remarks, please.
Your Highnesses, Excellencies, it's been 2 years since we launched PGII, a joint vision by the world's leading economies to invest in the infrastructure that low and middle income countries need. And 2 years on, more large-scale projects are seeing the light, and we are presenting two of them today. First, the India-Middle East-Europe Economic Corridor. This is nothing but historic. It will be the most direct connection to date between India, the Arabian Gulf, and Europe, with a rail link that will make trade between India and Europe 40% faster, with an electricity cable and a clean hydrogen pipeline to foster clean energy trade between Asia, the Middle East, and Europe, with a high-speed data cable to link some of the most innovative digital ecosystems in the world and create business opportunities all along the way. These are state-of-the-art connections for the world of tomorrow, faster, shorter, cleaner. This corridor is much more than just a railway or a cable. It is a green and digital bridge across continents and civilizations. And this is also the spirit of the second project we announced today, the Trans-African Corridor, which will connect the port of Lobito in Angola with the Katanga province in DRC and the Copper Belt in Zambia. Our goal is not only to connect a landlocked region to the sea. Our partnership will also invest in local value chains, in clean energy, and in skills for the local workforce. This is the spirit of PGII. It is a whole new approach to large infrastructure investment. It is about shared prosperity. It is about real benefits for all partners. Thank you.
Thank you, Excellency. May I now invite the President of France for his remarks, please.
Thank you so much. Everything was said, so I just want to thank Prime Minister Modi for organizing this meeting and President Biden for sharing this meeting with him. We are committed, and we had several exchanges with my friends Mohammed bin Zayed, and I want to thank you, Your Highness, and Mohammed bin Salman, Narendra Modi on this very important project. So everything was said. So now, with the European Commission, here as European governments, we commit to invest alongside with you on this road, and this is a very important project from Asia through Middle East to Europe to offer big opportunities and connect people. But our intention is as well to make it real, and to be sure that after this commitment we have concrete results, and especially to have the first global green trade road, meaning having net zero transport infrastructure, so to be sure that we have the best technologies. We have hydrogen being part of this project, and we channel all the possible common developments. I think as well our intention is to have a fair process, I mean offering a lot of opportunities to manufacture in the different countries and to cooperate very actively on building these roads, building the innovations going with it, and innovating together. I don't want to be longer. Thank you very much for this. This ceremony is very important. We commit together.
Thank you, Excellency. May I now invite the Chancellor of Germany for his remarks, please.
Thank you, and especially thank you, Narendra and Joe, for convening this event here. I think it is very important to remember that we launched the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment last year, and since then, PGII contributes to closing the global investment gap for quality infrastructure. As Emmanuel Macron already said, most about this initiative and all the activities we speak about today is already set, so I will not repeat it, just mentioning two questions. The first is we have to be active that these things can happen, and this is for me that we then have to also work on the infrastructure, the institutions that can work on financing, and for this I think it is also important to make the work of the World Bank successful. Germany will contribute an additional 305 million euro of hybrid capital to the World Bank, and this is one of the aspects which is a side of the activity here. We also try to work with Africa, and the Compact with Africa will convene in Berlin in November, also as a sign of creating infrastructure, developing economy, all the things we are together here.
Thank you, Excellency. May I now invite the Prime Minister of Japan for his remarks, please.
はい、ありがとうございます。PGII に関するサ
I
イドイベン
welcome
ト
the holding of this side event on Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment. On the occasion of the G7 Hiroshima Summit in May this year, as the G7 chair, Japan hosted a PGII meeting inviting private businesses for the first time, which was attended by leaders of G7 and partner countries. Japan is delivering various transport infrastructure development projects, including the construction of Delhi Metro here in the city to support economic development of partner countries. Going forward, we want to take this effort a step further to expand the scope of cooperation to wider areas, including supply chains, to link people together by strengthening connectivity. We also intend to work on building industrial value chains in the whole of Bay of Bengal. The Road Network Connectivity Improvement Plan and other northeastern regional development initiatives in India will be organically linked with the Bay of Bengal Industrial Growth Belt Initiative, or a Big B, that we are working on with Bangladesh. Furthermore, the Japan-ASEAN Comprehensive Connectivity Initiative that Japan announced at the ASEAN-related summit meeting will strengthen connectivity in a variety of areas, including transport infrastructure, digital connectivity, maritime cooperation, supply chains, electricity, as well as human and knowledge connectivity. In this way, Japan will continue to lead the effort for tangible implementation of PGII. To do that, partnership with diverse actors who subscribe to its principles is essential. For the promotion of PGII, I call on everyone gathered here once again to work together. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Excellency. May I now invite the Prime Minister of Italy for her remarks.
Your Highnesses, Excellencies, when we launched the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment just over a year ago, we committed to building better infrastructure for better future in low and middle income nations. We committed to cooperate with these nations with an equal, non-predatory approach to create new opportunities and prosperity. Today's launch of the new economic corridor between India and the Middle East and Europe goes precisely in this direction and is a milestone in strengthening global interconnections. And that is why I want to thank Prime Minister Modi, President Biden, and all the others, Ursula von der Leyen and all the others who made it possible, for it's a very important thing. This will scale up our economy's growth, opening enormous potential for mutual benefits in the business sector. Obviously, Italy is ready to play a decisive role in this process, also through the unique expertise of Italian companies in the maritime and railway sector. And we want to contribute in building bridges between the Mediterranean and the Indo-Pacific, also in the fields of energy and digital connectivity via Africa and the Arabian Gulf. In the energy sector, we can work in different fields, including the production and transport of green hydrogen from the Middle East to the Mediterranean. We also support the European Commission on the Helmet project, a high-voltage submarine electricity interconnection that will link Italy to Tunisia. We are working to strengthen digital connections critical for innovation and growth between the wider Mediterranean and Asia. Blue Raman, named after India's Nobel laureate in physics Raman, will connect Europe with India and involves major companies such as Google and Team Sparkle. However, we also are aware that there's still too much to be done to narrow the infrastructure gap with low and middle income nations, and this is why we will continue work on the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment during the Italian G7 presidency next year. Thank you. Thank you to everybody.
Thank you, Excellency. Thank you, Your Highnesses and Your Excellencies, for launching the landmark India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor. I would request all media and officials to remain seated and standing in their places while the leaders depart.
Excuse me for interrupting, but as we say in my body used to work, a point of personal privilege. I did not mention the Sheikh Mohammed of the UAE, but because I knew he wasn't speaking. But I do want to say thank you, thank you, thank you. I don't think we'd be here without you. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Highnesses and Excellencies. I would request all media to remain seated and standing in their position while the leaders leave the room. Thank you.
Thank you again.
Prime Minister Narendra Modi, US President Joe Biden and his allies, in fact, outlining the plan for a rail and shipping corridor that would connect India with the Middle East and ultimately the Europe. The project includes the United States of America, like you have seen the world leaders presenting it together. India, of course, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, the European Union and other countries in the G20, and Biden also, along with the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi and the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, all of these people plan to announce this. They have in fact announced this project as part of the Partnership for Global Infrastructure Investment. Remember, this is one important announcement that's coming in from the G20 Summit Day 1 as part of the global partnership on the infrastructure investment. The rail and shipping corridor would be enabling greater trade among the countries, and this was also be including the energy products. It could also be one of the most ambitious counters to China's massive infrastructure program, through which it has sought to connect more of the world to that country's economy, and that also is one aspect of looking at it. Let me take this across to my colleague Anand Narsimhan, who is with us on the broadcast. Anand, this important announcement probably is one of the game-changing facets of the G20 summit this evening.
Yes, it is. And look at what they're saying 2 years after the launch of the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment with the President of the United States. 2 new large-scale projects are seeing light. the India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor and the Trans-African Corridor. Now, this is something which has been just tweeted by the European Union head, von der Leyen, and Prime Minister Narendra Modi also then saying that this is the partnership on global infrastructure. Imagine the nations that are getting together to get this done. From India, you have the UAE, you have Saudi Arabia, then you get into France, and the European Union comes into play. The entire corridor that connects India to the European Union via so many other nations that include Jordan and Italy. This is a huge undertaking, along with creating jobs and opportunity, while Prime Minister Narendra Modi and President Joe Biden underlined the importance of connectivity. Look at what it's doing. It's trying to break. It's openly not just challenging the CPEC and the Belt and Road Initiative, but it is also trying to do away or move away, allowing European nations to move away from the Turkey-Russia hegemony in terms of the Trans-Asian pipeline. Turkey was known as the gateway to Europe and controlled the sea route and also the land route. But now if there is an alternative that's being built with these nations all coming together, nobody fathomed that this would happen. Imagine, more importantly, what the statement made by Emmanuel Macron, not just announcing it, getting into the concrete nitty-gritties and getting it done. That's what is important, and we need to get into it. So if there is a Trans-African corridor, and if there is this corridor that is the economic corridor that connects India to all of Europe via the Middle East, we've got two huge infrastructure projects that will connect these nations and economically tie them up. And when they're economically tied, clearly the geopolitics will subside and cooperation will increase. But more importantly, hegemonistic tendencies and forces will lose control.
Absolutely. In fact, Anand, stay on with us. Zaka Jacob is also live with us on the broadcast. Zaka, an important communication that came out of it all. We're calling it the game-changing event of the G20 today on day one. This is also slated to turn down those temperatures that are coming in from this turbulence and insecurity that emanates out of the Middle East. That's also one way to look at it. In fact, that was also, suggested in one of the statements that were released before the announcement of the project.
No, it was quite an interesting picture, isn't it? Prime Minister Modi at the center. To his right, there was Mohammed bin Salman, the leader of Saudi Arabia, and to his left was the US President Joe Biden. And, there's no love lost really between Joe Biden and MBS. But I think the initiative is the important one. This economic corridor between India, the Middle East, and Europe, it is a hugely significant one. Two of the biggest economies in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia and UAE, are part of it. The biggest economies in Europe, France, Germany, Italy, and of course the European Union, will find relevance and place in this. I think the importance of this economic corridor is that this is a direct challenge to the One Belt, One Road initiative of China. Now remember, we don't know the figures, how much each country is committing, but when you have the biggest economy in the world, the United States, which is backing this corridor that will go all the way from Asia, in India, through the Middle East, through Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, all the way to Europe, I think it's a direct challenge to the Belt and Road Initiative, because we have seen all kinds of problems in terms of debt financing, many of these smaller countries falling under a debt trap because of the BRI. So a lot of those countries are looking, and they have been looking to the United States for a number of years now for financing these infrastructure projects. Now the US is bringing together India, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and the major economies of Europe to bring this transnational corridor, this transnational economic corridor. Now, mind you, it's not going to be easy, because all of these countries will have to come together and pool in monies, because at the end of the day, building infrastructure is an expensive business. It's not a cheap business. China's BRI, by some estimates, is close to $1 trillion. But a lot of these smaller countries, whether it's in Africa, whether it's in Asia, even closer home in Sri Lanka, we've seen how this debt trap of China has really got a lot of these smaller countries stuck in this financial quagmire. So they are looking for a way out. So it's not just this corridor between Asia, the Middle East and Europe. There's also the Trans-Africa corridor. And we've seen the kind of investments China has made in Africa. Countries like Namibia have openly revolted against the debt trap induced by Chinese infrastructure projects there. So both of these combined, and I think now you get a better sense of why Xi Jinping decided to give this a skip, because clearly, his signature initiative, you remember when he came to power in 2013, this was the first big announcement he made. The new Silk Road was how the Chinese had framed it. The Maritime Silk Road was announced in Indonesia. The land route was announced in Kazakhstan. This, after 10 years, exactly 10 years after the Belt and Road Initiative, now the West, its partners in Asia, its partners in the Middle East are directly challenging China's sort of stranglehold or its vice-like grip over these infrastructure projects. They are saying, we're going to give you a more sustainable model of financial development. We're going to give you better infrastructure. There's also been criticism of Chinese projects for bad quality of its infrastructure. So the signaling also, and you heard President Biden say that, is that we're going to give you better quality infrastructure and we're going to give you more sustainable financing to build that infrastructure. So I think, as important, I think the two big headlines that have come out of the New Delhi G20 Summit are, one, the New Delhi Declaration, how they've managed to find consensual language, particularly on the Russia-Ukraine war, which was acceptable to everyone. And the second one, and perhaps in my view, an even bigger one than the joint declaration, was the fact that they've announced this massive economic corridor connecting Asia all the way to Western Europe.
Thank you so much for that perspective, Anand. And I'll take my cue from there, in fact, Zaka, and I'll take my cue from there, Anand. Talking about the China question, on the one hand, we are looking at the joint declaration. On the other hand, this also will be bringing in the headline of further alienation of China. How does one juxtapose these two aspects when we look at this important announcement of this corridor?
The One Belt, One Road and also the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative. But there the big difference is it was one nation that was bankrolling it, and it was pushing nations into a debt trap diplomacy to force them into submission and to commit to whatever infrastructure they wanted or China wanted to fulfill its own hegemonistic needs. Here it's a collaborative effort of strong economies. US, of course, cash-rich nations like the UAE, the entire group of the Emirati nations, and then you also have the Saudi Arabia. Strong, robust economy like India, which will soon be the third largest economy. So if you look at the overall grouping, and then you have France and Germany, strong economies in Europe, Italy part of it, Jordan also has its own coffers. So each of these nations is individually able to participate and chip in, which becomes interesting and which becomes important. This is where perhaps this economic corridor initiative is different. We've got a lot of new noise around us because the Biofuel Alliance is also being announced at the media center, and somebody just seems to have amped up the noise. Now it's come down. Let me just continue. What's important is that this is an economic corridor, not just rail. So there is going to be port, there's going to be roads, there's going to be rail, and it's all going to be integrated and connecting, and it's going to break borders. The moment the economics comes in, moment connectivity and trade comes in, and there are multiple nations who are invested in it collectively, the ability of getting work done faster is greater. And it's not just one nation's risk that's exposed or one nation's hegemonistic tendencies. This seems to be a collaboration. That's where perhaps the difference is. China will be watching this very, very closely. It will try and amp up and it will push through. See, they are following a blueprint that was laid down way back in 1949 by Mao Zedong. Yes. So Xi Jinping, and from Mao Zedong till Xi Jinping till now, and going forward till about 2049, they're going to follow the same objectives till 100 years and where they want to look at their dominance. But they also realize that if nations move away from them, if they become economically weaker, then they will not be able to achieve their dreams. The economic crisis in China is currently pushing them back. Nations looking at alternatives to China or a China plus one or anywhere but China philosophy is also going to hurt them. Economic prosperity, tantamounts to a lot of other might. Military might you have to back to support, protect your economic might, but economic might is where it all started for China. They spent 33 decades becoming economically stronger and then invested. Yes. Now these nations are going to collectively work towards saying, let just not one nation corner the market and also control the market. They've learned their lesson.
All right. Thank you so much for that, Anand and Zaka. Thank you so much for joining us on the broadcast. And with that, let's in fact begin with this evening's key points on Viewpoint. Thank you so much for staying with us. I'm Rehatul Siddiqui. So very good evening and a warm welcome. Now, the G20 and the India's presidency has adopted a consensus declaration on issues facing the bloc. This was the big announcement that was made by Prime Minister Narendra Modi during the summit today. Now, after over 150 hours of intense negotiations, the negotiators from 20 countries finalized the language on the Ukraine conflict. This morning, in fact, the Prime Minister inaugurated the two-day summit by calling on the members to end a quote-unquote global trust deficit, and also announced that the bloc was granting permanent membership to the African Union in an effort to make it more representative. And despite divisions in the grouping over the Russia-Ukraine war and China's ambitions in the Indo-Pacific and the South China Sea, the press conference organized just a short while back had a positive story to tell, especially so as during the summit in Indonesia in 2022, the group was deeply divided over the war in Ukraine, as the declaration then had noted that while most nations condemned Russia for the invasion in Ukraine, there were also divergent views. But the word that came out this evening from the likes of the Sherpa of G20, Amitabh Kant, and the External Affairs Minister, Dr. S. Jaishankar, was that the Delhi Declaration was one that had 100% unanimity, and it did not come with any sort of a footnote. The leaders went on to add that this has been the most ambitious presidencies in the G20 history, especially after India assumed this presidency in the troubled times of the geopolitical conflict. The day that started with Prime Minister Narendra Modi inaugurating the Group of 20 Leaders Summit, sitting behind the Bharat placard, piquing the interests of many, also saw a series of bilaterals that the Prime Minister Narendra Modi had on the sidelines of the summit with the UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak and also the Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida.
खुशखबरी मिली है हमारी टीम्स के हार्डवर्क से और आप सभी के सहयोग से नई दिल्ली G20 लीडर समिट डिक्लेरेशन पर सहमति बनी है।
All G20 member states have come to New Delhi with a strong sense of responsibility about addressing the most pressing global challenges. Speaking for India, we are clear that no one left behind.
Under the guidance of Honorable Prime Minister, India's G20 presidency has worked for the theme One Earth, One Family, One Future.
And before I bring in my guests on the broadcast here on Viewpoint, we are getting some more breaking news. Remember, I just spoke about the bilateral that the UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak had with Narendra Modi, and now there is word coming in from 10 Downing Street. It has in fact tweeted the leaders, partners and friends. Prime Minister Rishi Sunak and Prime Minister Narendra Modi met today at the G20 Summit. They in fact discussed the close and growing ties between UK and India, and in fact had a productive conversation on work towards delivering the United Kingdom-India Free Trade Agreement. Remember, this was something that was much talked about. This was something that was the need of the hour. This conversation had started in January in 2021, and on the sidelines of the G20 summit, they were looking at reaching some sort of consensus when it was about the UK-India Free Trade Agreement. And there, that word is coming in from Downing Street. Possibly a consensus has been arrived at, and possibly a conclusion will be arrived at very, very soon. So it's a positive sort of an outcome that has happened after the leaders met on the sidelines of the G20 summit. We'll be speaking more about that and all of that transpired today on day one of the G20 summit. Let me open this up to my guests who join us on the broadcast this evening on Viewpoint. Gurjeet Singh, who's a former diplomat, is with us. Also with us is Professor Brahmachalani, who's a strategic affairs editor, expert. Also with us is Fred Vaya, who's a Russian affairs expert. And also with us is Richard Haniana, who's the president of the Center for Study of Partisanship and Ideology in California. We'll of course be getting us another speaker in just a short while who'll also give us a democratic perspective from the Washington DC. Remember, the all-important bilateral with President Joe Biden also happened yesterday with Prime Minister Narendra Modi. Let me actually begin with the first guest that I had announced, Mr. Gurjeet Singh. Mr. Singh, the all-important corridor announcement has just about happened. It's a historic step. It's also talking about how this will alienate China further. What do you first make out of this huge announcement that's coming out of G20?
Thank you. So I think this is stupendous. And we have had in the past announcements about Build Back Better, the Global Gateway, the India-EU connectivity partnership, but there was never a project to go with it. So today you seem to have a project which will go with all these ideas together. So the crux lies in, can we get our procurement systems aligned? With China, that is never a problem because it is one entity. But I have studied trilateral cooperation for long now, and I find that the major problem is how to align your procurement systems. And that is what we will learn to have to do. What is the role India will play? Certainly our market access would be very important.
Yes.
But I think Indian companies would have a great role to grasp EPC and construction contracts in getting this done because they have great experience in both West Asia and Africa. So I think that part could do very well. But please, let's be cautious. Every time there's a G20, a lot of announcements are made. The last time in Bali, they promised Indonesia $20 billion for a just energy transition. A year down the line, not a dollar has flowed. So, we're extremely optimistic, extremely happy, but I am still cautious. I would like to see plans come into force. It's a good move to have the project.
Okay. Professor Chelani, would you agree to what Mr. Singh has just said, considering this is being considered as one of the more ambitious counters to China's infrastructural projects? Would you consider it so, or would you also wait for something to happen on ground first?
I would be cautious simply because this is a memorandum of understanding among the US, India, Saudi Arabia, the UAE and other nations to quote unquote explore a shipping and rail corridor that will stretch from India to Europe via the Middle East. The economic feasibility of this project will have to be examined very carefully. So there are a lot of things that need to be examined before this project can take off. And this project initiative is not part of the G20. This has emerged on the sidelines from the discussions that leaders of America, India, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE were having. So the G20 summit by itself, however, has an important message about China's colonial style lending. China has been pursuing death trap diplomacy, which has ensnared a number of nations in Africa, Latin America, and Asia in a Chinese debt trap. To counter China's predatory lending, the G20, in its consensus document, has agreed to reshape the World Bank, increase its capacity to lend to the poorer countries, lend money for infrastructure projects. So making the World Bank a larger institution geared to helping poorer countries address their infrastructure challenges is an important step and a clear signal to China that it's not going to be the only game in town.
Okay. Okay. Let me actually bring Mr. Fred here. Fred Weyer, I'd like to understand from you, and we are going back to what we started with, talking about the joint declaration. A consensus has been arrived. The announcement that came out of G20 Day 1 today was this is with 100% unanimity. There has been no footnote. There has been no discrepancy whatsoever. Of course, it came after a lot of deliberation. China and Russia were at the center of it all, considering their presidents were absent from the G20 summit this year in India. Now, with this announcement of a rail and the rail corridor coming in very, very close to that announcement of a joint declaration coming in, how do you juxtapose the two? How do you read the joint declaration and also this conversation about alienating China that the corridor announcement will be making?
Well, first of all, I think India is to be congratulated
for
navigating that situation, and especially the passages on the Ukraine war. It certainly will be received not with satisfaction, but with equanimity in Moscow. And there's nothing there that will bother them. And I'm sure their delegation signed on to it easily enough. it means that that bullet has been dodged as far as Moscow is concerned, because it has been a constant feature of all these meetings, you know, that this contention over the Ukraine war and the insistence on both Western countries and Russia in making that the central issue all the time. And in this case, they've been sidelined, both the United States and Western countries, and Russia has sort of been gently pushed aside in favor of bigger issues that are of concern to the global majority. And I think India really navigated that well and brought those issues front and center. Beyond that, I don't think there's anything about that will all the results of this meeting will be warmly welcomed in Moscow. I don't know Beijing. I'm not a Chinese expert, but Moscow won't be bothered by any of it. They have their own plans in Africa. In Latin America, they also have their outreach plans. They're more modest than the Chinese ones. But for instance, if we're speaking about transport corridors, Russia is heavily involved in the transport corridor from Iran up through Azerbaijan to connect with the Russian rail network that goes both east and west from there. I think that's underway. There's a section of railroad still to be built in Iran. So there's more than one transport corridor going on in the world.
Yes.
But
Fred, it's not just about the transport corridor, and more than Russia, I think China should be more impacted, because this talks about alienating China further. What I like your views about would be the joint declaration per se, because if we actually, read through the lines and actually declassify the text that has come out, in fact, from the declaration, there has been a lot that's been said, including the fact that human suffering, negative impact on food and energy security must be avoided. They're also talking about the use of threat of nuclear weapons, which is completely inadmissible. They also talk about refrain from use of force for territorial acquisition. How do you think Moscow is going to be reading those statements?
Yeah, I don't think the Russians will like some of them, but they are cropping up everywhere. International law is there; it exists. Most countries, and even Russia, when you're talking about a different subject than Ukraine, agrees with those principles. But on the whole, I don't think that it will like, if you're asking what would it impact, it won't disturb India-Russia relations, for instance. I think they're just fine. China, I don't know whether China feels isolated or not. I don't know why President Xi didn't come to the G20. Perhaps he had his reasons. I think Putin just didn't come because he was worried about this contentious animosity erupting over the Ukraine war, and sitting in the same room with Joe Biden probably didn't suit him. But otherwise, and it should be pointed out too, that Russia is very enthusiastic about some of these alternative formats, like the BRICS, which India is also a member of, which they find more amenable as forums, because there are no Western countries there for pushing agendas that matter to Russia. And because of the situation right now in the world, Russia is very focused on geopolitics to the expense of almost everything else.
Okay. Richard, let me bring you in here. I want to understand, if we go and talk further about the declaration that has come out specifically about after two important bilaterals that Prime Minister Narendra Modi, the Indian Prime Minister, had with the Prime Minister of the UK and also the President of the United States of America. How much of that would be, which possibly would have had a bearing on what has come out of this joint communique?
So I think the other guests are correct to focus on sort of the shadow of China throughout this event. I think in the West, there's been sort of a narrative shift since COVID-19, in which China has they've started to become more pessimistic about the future of China. China is in some ways seen as more threatening. At the same time, I think it's lost some of its sort of reputation for competence. The economy has slowed the way they handled COVID. China was always seen as at least competent and rising. And I think a lot of that has, got away a little bit. And I think in contrast, the stock of India has risen. I think India has done really well the last few years. Chinese birth rate has collapsed while India, has passed it in population. And so I think that there is sort of a mutual interest between the West and India right now in order to really sing India's praises, to sort of bring India into a global leadership role. Now they are not, their interests and their ideas about the world order are not completely aligned, and so you will see things like Modi will, wants to bring African Union into G20. There's disagreements about things like that, and Ukraine, of course. And so they've got to work these things out. But overall, I think the conference has been, just good for both sides, and they're getting what they want out of it. And yes, the role of China in the world is always in the background.
Okay. Professor Chalani, they say the devil is in the detail. If we break down the statement that has come out of the 83 paragraphs, I believe more than 8 have been dedicated to the geopolitical conflict. And this was what the bone of contention was, especially after the presidents of Russia and China decided to skip the G20 summit in India. When you actually read through the statements that have come out, how do you see that being read by China and Russia? And when we talk about that relationship, both the External Affairs Minister and so also the G20 Sherpa, Mr. Kant, had reiterated this one aspect, that among the G20 nations, it was the G20 emerging economies like Brazil, like South Africa, like Indonesia. They were the ones that were responsible at arriving at this consensus. So how does one read that statement?
First, I think the G20 has traditionally been a Western-dominated organization. The West, plus its allies like Australia, Japan, and South Korea, make up the majority of the membership of the G20. So bringing in the African Union has been a very important step in making this organization more inclusive. If the European Union can be a member of the G20, certainly the African Union was certainly qualified to be a member of the G20 too. So in that sense, India has succeeded, at least by including the African Union, in making the G20 more inclusive. You mentioned about Russia and China leaders being absent, but the fact is that Xi Jinping and Putin didn't come, but their delegations were there. The Chinese premier was here, and they participated in the deliberations. They were party to the consensus document that has emerged, the New Delhi Declaration. So this declaration definitely embodies the agreement of all the group, the entire group, including all the 20 member states of this group, this bloc. But it's important to remember one thing, though, that on the contentious issue of Ukraine, India managed to secure consensus and help adopt this broader document by avoiding casting blame on anyone for the war that is raging in Ukraine. For example, if you look at what the Bali Declaration said, the Bali Declaration had very strong language. It deplored in the strongest terms, it said, deplores in the strongest terms the aggression by the Russian Federation against Ukraine and demands its complete and unconditional withdrawal from the territory of Ukraine. That was the language in Bali. That language is missing from the New Delhi Declaration. Instead, the New Delhi Declaration on Ukraine conflict just begins by mentioning the conflict, the war in Ukraine, and then talks about general principles. Principles like avoiding the use or threat of use of force, or refraining from changing borders by force. So these are general principles, and by emphasizing the general principles, India played a very important role in helping this bloc reach consensus on the larger economic and climate change challenges that the world faces.
Okay, we will also be talking about the climate change aspect of it all, but if we actually go to Mr. Gurjeet Singh, the entire G20 Summit Day 1 today started with the Prime Ministerial address and also him sitting behind the Bharat placard. That was something that had in fact generated a lot of eyeballs, and many critics believe that in a global forum making a political statement was sort of uncalled for. However, the others are of the view that whatever India decides to call itself, it's an internal matter. Internationally, it will be picked up as is projected. What are your views of that, considering that started the G20 summit today? And then further, we can talk about the all-important challenges that, the climate change needs to be actually dealt with.
So on a day which is perhaps the high point of Indian diplomacy since independence, we are talking about the placard, we are talking about China and Ukraine, which are not the main issues. The main issues is turning G20 towards humanity. And we have brought to bear the responsibility of the emerging countries and the global south onto the G20 and made them listen. Now, what India calls itself is India's business, and our constitution clearly says India, that is Bharat. Secondly, India has persuaded all that the Ukraine crisis needs to be downplayed and not allow big power rivalry to overrun the G20. So I think that is a success, and the biggest success was to bring in the African Union right at the start, showing that consensus building is going to dominate the New Delhi G20. And as Mr. Chelani said, the weight of the expectations and responsibilities towards the global south is the sheer importance of this G20. And now if you look at the Biofuel Alliance, you look at the infrastructure, you look at the digital public goods, you look at so many initiatives, you can't count them. Those are the real successes. I really wish we would focus on that than the absence of a Chinese leader or what they didn't do. As the foreign minister said today, every G20 country contributed to the declaration, and we have their concurrence. That is the success of India and the G20 today.
Absolutely. And Fred, this point that Mr. Singh was making, I'd like to have your views on that, considering India is being projected as the big brother to the global south. How do you see that projection? Like Mr. Gurjeet Singh was mentioning, at the very onset of the summit was the announcement of inclusion of the African Union into the G20. It will be a group of 21 nations now, with the African Union also now standing included. And this, of course, offers more inclusivity, considering the G7 was expanded into G20 for this very reason. And that is an important posturing at the start of the summit. How does one see that?
You're talking to me?
Yes, Fred.
Yes. I think that is a very bold move, expansion. And it is an expansion in that multipolar direction. Certainly, Russian and Chinese leaders favor, and I think it also is a move to democratize the G20. It will. I think broaden the participation and empower the global south more. I mean, we are living in a world where the tectonic plates are shifting, and we're going to be, within a very short period of time, living in a very different world in terms of global economy and also the distribution of global political power. And so I think India stepping up and promoting this expansion was extreme. It was audacious, but it also really pushes that shift faster and more in a direction of creating a world where formerly disempowered people have a voice. How would that be received in Moscow? I think they'll be all in favor of it.
Okay, okay. Richard, I'd like to understand from you, the one point that also came out, and if we go back to this joint declaration, was also the important need of countering terrorism. There was a conversation, especially if we cater to the bilateral that was between the UK Prime Minister and the Indian Prime Minister. There was one aspect of counterterrorism that was discussed, I believe, also with the United States of America. And that also forms an important aspect of what is the communication that's coming out of G20. How does one read that, Richard?
Yeah, well, I mean, the terrorism issue, I think, is connected to the African issue that we just talked about. I mean, most of the terrorism of the world in the last few years, most of the deaths and most of the destruction has moved to Africa from the Middle East. The extent to which, it's good sort of PR for India. Yeah, I mean, India has always done things like this, going back to the non-aligned movement to, try to raise the voice of the poorer countries in the world. But Africa, it's an open question how much they would be able to contribute to something like the G20. I mean, there's been half a dozen countries in Africa that have had coups within the last 2 years. The governments are very unstable, in part because of the terrorism issue. So it's all connected. I mean, to be able to bring Africa into the G20, to give Africa more of a role in global institutions, is going to require stability, and requiring stability is going to require dealing with the terrorism issue, which is really ravaging the northern part of the continent.
All right. In fact, before I come back to my panel of guests, I request all you gentlemen to stay on with us. We are getting some more breaking news from the G20 Summit. We would play out that. There's in fact a tweet that has been posted by the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi. He in fact has tweeted that history has been created with the adoption of the New Delhi Leaders' Declaration. He's talking about the joint declaration that has been with 100% unanimity coming out of the G20 right ahead of day 2, that is tomorrow, of the G20 Summit. United in consensus and spirit, he further goes on to write, we pledge to work collaboratively for a better, more prosperous and harmonious future. He further goes on to say, my gratitude to all fellow G20 members for their support and cooperation. That's the word coming in by the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi. India as president of the G20 has achieved a very, very important aspect with this mutually decided upon communication that has come about from the G20 summit right on day 1. Remember, the entire conversation was around it, and India has managed to achieve it right at the onset of this G20 summit. I go back to my guest now. Professor Chalani, I'd like to understand from you, there was of course, a lot that has happened through the way of bilaterals that are happening on the sidelines of the summit. And of course, there are various aspects that are being discussed regarding India's positioning. I was asking that question earlier to Mr. Singh as well. India as a leader to the global south, India as a bridge between global south and the global north. How do you see that posturing really coming out of G20?
Reha, as you know, the world is getting more divided. So we have one divide between Russia and China on one side and the Western bloc on the other side. And then there's the Western clash with the rising global south. India is trying to play the role of a bridge builder, which is a very important role, because if you heard Modi's statements today when he was addressing the 2 different sessions of the G20, his messaging was, to rise above other leaders who were talking about advancing national interests. He was talking about advancing the interests of the entire humanity. So India is trying to play the role of a bridge builder by seeking to focus attention on pressing global challenges. This is not an easy task given the growing international divisiveness, but you're right that India is trying to position itself as a country that is willing to broker deals to help advance international interests. But at the same time, India is also seeking to advance its own economic and geopolitical interests. For example, Prime Minister Modi had more than 15 bilateral meetings with leaders attending the G20 Summit. More than 15. So he was quite busy over 2 days, engaging with leaders on the margins of the summit. But it's important to note that he did not have a formal bilateral meeting with one leader. That was the Premier of China.